All right. Well, while everyone is getting back to their seats and grabbing their coffee and finishing their amazing conversations, I want to take a moment to just introduce Dr. Cecile Carson. What a rowdy bunch. What a rowdy bunch. Litter people. Okay. So Dr. Carson is an old friend of Keep Pennsylvania Beautiful. Cecile attended our Litter Summit in 2019 and has worked with Shannon and her team on and off again for the last 10 years on various projects. Cecile has demonstrated a history of working with national, state, and local nonprofits, civic organizations, and government agencies. She is skilled in qualitative and quantitative research with expertise on analysis of waste, litter, blight, and community engagement. Cecile holds a doctorate in learning and organizational change. Cecile is an amazing Texan, and she has a wonderful spirit, and I'm just going to welcome you up to the stage.
Good morning. I don't know about you, but having been involved in this process for as long as I am totally nerding out on Pennsylvania Fights Dirty. I mean, come on. And I had to do that because now we're going to talk about litter law enforcement. Okay, which is also an important piece and a connection to this process, and definitely something that I appreciate the opportunity of working with Keep Pennsylvania Beautiful on, and how we can really delve now into another level of research. So this is that next step in understanding some of the pieces of the action plan, which included a provision about regulatory and enforcement action. And what we found is that that's one piece of the process. It's not going to solve the whole problem of litter and illegal dumping, but it's an important and essential piece of that process. And so the research that has been conducted is a joint project between Keep Pennsylvania Beautiful and Palmetto Pride, which is also has under their umbrella the South Carolina Litter Law Enforcement Association and Keep South Carolina Beautiful. The research, again, as I said, it's like delves into that next step of really understanding what current conditions are, looking at what works and what maybe the potential is to make some adjustments in that process. So Shannon and the team from Keep Pennsylvania Beautiful did a request from the Administrative Office of PA Courts about a year ago, or actually February of 2021, got back in April of that year over 20,457 pieces of line item data with hundreds, literally, of additional kind of outcomes in that process. And I think looked at that and went, how do you tell a story from this? How do you take this data and tell the story from it? So we had conversations and discussed the fact that what we needed to do was figure out how we could take the numbers and really make them a story. It's sort of like, because you can do that, but sometimes people just look at, oh my gosh, there are 20,000 numbers from 2016 to 2020. That's the number of cases that were actually filed within the system at that state level. How do you tell that story? Well, and how do you validate it? So that's quantitative. Well, how about some qualitative research? And the qualitative research starts with kind of gathering the stories, which produce numbers, but you need to be able to tell that story. But more importantly, you need to put the two together. So what we did was we looked at the ticket and fine analysis information, and then we did interviews with individuals that were within the enforcement system and the process, and then kind of triangulated those together. It's sort of like, does one help to validate the other? Did we find something different from what the data says from what the officers are saying in the information? And so this information today is being shared specifically for Pennsylvania. And I did want to say that there are some limits around the data and what I'm talking about with litter law enforcement, because we looked at state statutes only. We didn't look at your local ordinances. This was what was filed through the PA court system. So that's one piece. I viewed a cross-section of individuals that are within the enforcement community. So code enforcement officers, solid waste authority representatives, individuals that are at the local municipal police level, state police level, magistrates, but it doesn't necessarily represent the whole enforcement system. But we did try very hard to get a good cross-section so that we feel very much that this does represent generally the attitudes and the perceptions of those individuals in the field. And also that one of the things that we weren't able to do is, in some cases, be able to tell whether these are first offenses or second offenses for someone just because of the way that filing was done. So with those limitations, what I'm going to share with you are what the key findings were, and then from those key findings, what recommendations could be identified from those key findings. And many of them weave together with what you've already heard today, which is really exciting because the work, it's not just starting from scratch. This is helping to validate some of the things that the secretaries and the department representative talked about, and especially the public awareness campaign. So the first item was that litter and illegal dumping is an important issue. It's a continuing issue. It's something that is being seen in one way numerically, as this graph shows, is that there's been an increase in the number of tickets written each year from 2016 through 2020. And that included the year of the pandemic. So that took the information through that year. So there's an interest on the behalf of law enforcement officers to write tickets for littering and illegal dumping. So it's important to them from a standpoint of writing tickets, which is really tricky because it's hard to catch litterers and illegal dumpers, right? It just is. It doesn't happen magically, which a couple of the quotes kind of emphasize that I wanted to put in, is that there's the challenge of, an officer saying, it's sort of like, okay, I can write the tickets and I can take it to court, and, we go through the process and we have the attorneys and we have everybody involved in this system, but then if, there's not a way to make that a priority and it to be a priority in the state, is it really that important for me to spend that time doing that and that effort? So it's like you want to be, as an officer, have appreciation of the fact that, yes, you're a part, as I said, a piece of that puzzle, and that it is a priority. And then also, how many of you in the room have witnessed someone littering? Right? Okay. How many of you in the room have witnessed someone littering who's a law enforcement officer? Okay, it's a much smaller number, right? So those of us who may see the litterer may not be able to catch them. Just like this quote on the bottom said, we could sit there all day, 24/7, and never see one litter. The chances are it might be better to actually catch someone who threw a cigarette butt out at night, because we'd see that flame come out the window, right? So it's sort of like the chances are this is a very difficult process. And there's also a difference in the process of being able to determine whether or not you're going to be able to catch someone for littering versus illegal dumping, which is the next finding. There's confusion between those two. And I will say the confusion basically exists with the individuals who write the public policy. Not with the enforcement officials. The enforcement officials, you ask them what the definition of litter is, and it's sort of like not necessarily the statute right out of the book, but they're going to be able to tell you that litter is basically something that somebody tosses out of a window, or it's going to come flowing out of the back of the truck. It's sort of illegal dumping is the stuff that stops, and then someone removes large quantities of materials. There's a difference in those two. But when it comes to public policy, in many cases, the terms get interchanged. And as one officer told me, they're wildly different. And I want people to understand that. So they were like it's like they're so different, and yet we group them together in this process. So it becomes challenging from that standpoint to look at what the public policy is and also address the public will. So that public will comes back to, I'm an officer, I want to write the ticket. Are you going to support me doing that and encouraging the justices and the policymakers to help us be able to address this from an enforcement perspective? So another big finding that came out of this is one of the reasons I think there's confusion amongst the definitions is that there's also 13 different ways that you can write a citation in the state, right? Statute, subsection, it's sort of like almost impossible, I will have to say, for any of the officers that I spoke to, we really pinpoint that we write it off of this particular statute subsection venereal. So out of the 13, primarily they were written in two sections. One is for the crimes codes about depositing materials that shouldn't be there, as you would guess, bottles, cans, butts, all of those items, onto land, which includes the streets and the waterways, in the process. And then the second code that was very closely filed was the vehicle code, which is that tossing it, throwing it out of the window, or having it come out. So those are the two, but there's all these other possibilities, which leads to confusion. Some opportunities, as you'll see with the recommendations, to try to think about how some of this might be able to be streamlined. Doesn't necessarily need to be in every section, or if it is in different parts of the statutes, that there's more consistency behind it, especially when it comes to the fine part. Because this was another piece of important kind of question that was asked to try to validate through the research was, do higher fines really work, right? Are higher fines, the way to go? Because how many of you in the room, and maybe if you're an elected official, have said, if it just cost more, they wouldn't do it. If it just hit them harder in the pocketbook, they wouldn't do it. Well, the research shows that, number one, on this slide, it shows that when it gets to the magistrate level, it's very unlikely that they're actually going to give the highest level of the fines, right? Those two statutes that I shared, the range on a first offense is $50 to $300, second offense $300 to $1,000. The average fine on that bottom line is about $150, but over 25% of the 25% of the case disposition was for $50 or less, right? So they gave the court fines, but not necessarily the fine part, because they have the discretion to do that. And as some of the officers said, this is it's sort of like very challenging. Why do I want to write a ticket where, number one, as an officer, I can write the ticket, but I don't know what the fine's going to be that the judge is going to issue on the end, and whether there's going to be anything there on the first, is there really ever going to be a fine on it? But surprisingly, the magistrates on the other side were, well, I thought if we just kind of like slapped them on the hand and I gave them a lower fine, but I made them pay the restitution, or I made them pay something, that was enough, until one of the magistrates said, one of the officers began to explain to me all the hours of investigation, especially for illegal dumping, and all the hours of preparing the case. And then I realized that it's sort of like, that's not the best way to do that. This is not the best way to handle it. So overall, the officers concurred that higher fines are not the way to go, right? What is it that's going to be impactful, but something that you feel like is a high enough fine that it has an impact? And pretty much routinely, officers and even the magistrate said it would be a whole lot better to have something that was more of a flat fee, where you knew going into it what to expect, and that somebody gets penalized for that. So much more in line with the driver's offense of some matters, so that it's sort of like, if you charge, in this case, the officer said, it's sort of like we could charge a higher fine, and then we make everybody unhappy. Because if they get the higher fine, then they choose to pay it out, which then when they choose to pay it out, they make the court people work harder on this installment plan, then they get frustrated and mad with us. So if they're in the court office and they're unhappy about this process, they're probably vocalizing that, which means the magistrate's not going to want to have a higher fine either. So it's sort of like it becomes a real challenge, but validates the officers don't think that the higher fines work, and the courts are not actually issuing them at the highest amounts either. So an important piece of research, and something that there's no data on this. This is a first. Pennsylvania is a leader again in this process. This research doesn't exist anywhere. It's like there's research on drivers, DUIs, there's not on fine structure and what the outcomes of that has been. So hopefully this will start another conversation about how do we use enforcement to address litter and illegal dumping, and not can we keep increasing the fine, and that being the sole solution to it. So another interesting part of the findings was around community service. So there are provisions in the codes that talk about having community service. So you'll go out and do X number of hours depending on the offense in order to meet your requirements. That's part of your sentencing. The good news is that a guilty rate is about 83%. So if it makes it to the court, 83% of the cases up until 2020 were adjudicated as guilty. It dropped in 2020 to 66%. I think that probably is an anomaly based on a lot of waived cases or inactive cases that were included in the research. But it's the fine that has that longest blue line there. Community service, and I know that you'll hear about this maybe this afternoon in one of the breakouts, is that one of the officers who's sitting in the room in the back and nodding her head is, I'm still waiting for those community service people to show up because they haven't been assigned, right? And a judge who told me, a magistrate who said, well, I would like to assign them, but I can't get anybody to take the community service. They say they don't have time, they don't have the structure, they don't want to do this. So shockingly, based on the research that we got from the state, there were 24 community service assignments. As Shannon said with the exclamation point, over 5 years, all right? I'd love to delve into this deeper and try to figure it out, but it's sort of like we cross-reference, we recross-reference, we cross-reference. Right. The data that we were provided showed 24 cases over the 5-year period of community service. And like I said, this is where that mixed methods comes together. You heard from the officers, you heard from the justices, the same comment. This is hard to do. So what can we do to try to address making community service easier for us? The last of the findings dealt with waste management services, access, confusion in jurisdictions where one jurisdiction has one set of a way of handling waste services and the next jurisdiction has a different way. People get confused about them. Something that's going to help be resolved, it sounds like, with the new waste transfers, but that just there's not accessibility to it, so it makes it difficult to cross over. And then a whole variety of things that can be addressed also, like having the right kind of infrastructure. The open-top containers were an encouragement for more dumping, and they were encouragement for littering also, because if that's not covered, why should I cover the back of my truck when I'm driving my 15 miles to go drop it off at the open-top container, because there's that perception or connection. This is open, that's open, it doesn't really matter in the process. So littering and illegal dumping also around closed facilities, so that, it's sort of like, when do you find the biggest problems? Well, if your drop-off center is closed on the weekends, then Monday there's all the trash. If it closes at 5 o'clock, by 8 o'clock the next morning, you're going to find stuff because people are dropping it off there too. So that leads to some of those issues. So on to the recommendations. So the recommendations very strongly showed that there needed to be some consolidation of the actual ordinances or statutes, and to make those simpler in what they were, to try to have a focus also so that there's a discussion about littering, that out the window or maybe from the back of the truck, versus what are the penalties for the illegal dumping. So it's sort of like, again, they're similar but wildly different in the way that they get enforced in the process. Also to try to be clearer on kind of the complexity of this process. So looking more, as I mentioned, about that traffic ticket. So that someone knows. It's sort of like, if you're going to write them a ticket. You know, I had one officer that said, I'm not going to write somebody, I know bottles are really bad and they shouldn't be littered at all, but it's sort of like, I'm really going to write somebody a fine for $300 for throwing a plastic bottle out. Is that going to really, is that really going to go through the court case and happen? So it's like, what's enough? What's a high enough level, again, that it has that impact, but maybe it's not that range where it's $50 to $300 or $100 to $1,000. It's sort of like, what's a more realistic piece of that puzzle in the process. Next, in that simplification process was an alignment. Alignment of all of the statutes, so that we didn't look, as I said, one of the limitations of this was that we didn't look specifically at local laws, but really local laws should match up with the state statutes or vice versa. Because, you know, it's sort of like, how many of you really know when you go out of one jurisdiction and into another jurisdiction, unless the state or the government has put that little sign over there that says, now entering, you know, this borough, or now entering this township, or now entering this city. It's sort of like, we don't know. It's like when you cross over. So it's sort of having that consistency, again, makes it easier for enforcement, and quite frankly, it makes it easier for those of us in this room to be able to say, this is what the fine is. You know, this is what the fine is in the state. And another innovative or creative item that came out of the discussions was, fairly consistently, there was a comment about you know, DUI enforcement changed with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It's sort of like they really brought forth a standardization process, and that they'd like to be able to see that done with littering and illegal dumping enforcement also. So was there a way that you could model some of the lessons learned from DUIs to apply to littering and illegal dumping? And one of the items was, maybe instead of the community service, you have to do X number of hours of educational training. It's like, maybe there's an online course, more like a defensive driving course. Maybe that's another way. As if one of the magistrates made the comment, it's sort of like how do I get them to understand, and maybe having to spend time learning about what the impacts are of litter on our environment might make the difference in that process. The streamlining of the process, also this kind of reiterates some of the things that I talked about before, but another piece of that streamlining is the technology. Did I tell you there was 20,000 of these codes that we went through? And the way it took 2 months to get the data pulled, because according to the state, it's sort of like, this is really hard to do, to pull this information. In the process. So it's sort of like, you know, looking at all these different statutes that we're going through to collect the data. So being able to have the data where it's more accessible also to the officers and to the magistrates could make a difference in helping with that streamlining of the process as well. And being able to have that more readily available. From a national perspective, that's also something I think would be very valuable. To be able to have that data and to have it more consistent, so that people know, again, kind of elevates that priority request that was made by one of the officers. Not surprisingly, the public awareness campaign, education and training was a huge piece also to think about. The comments that were made through the qualitative research really asked for that public awareness campaign, and I think this is that emphasizing part, that second piece. It's sort of like you've got the big umbrella, and that was needed. That was one of the items, and this research was done with the interviews from March until June. So obviously the campaign came out after, but it validates the need for that. But then also to add that next piece, which is when you start to target in on a campaign to talk about some of those impacts so that people understand, and they understand why they're enforcing. Why is enforcement important? To be able to talk about the laws and penalties as a piece of that and have some understanding and agreement with it. So PA fights dirty, and it could cost you $150 for a ticket if you do it. Might be a way that you could connect those two together based on the interviews that was done. Also, unanimously across the interviews was that we needed to look at training as a whole systems approach. That targeting education to particular groups, targeting magistrates so that they understand what their roles and responsibility is important, targeting what the roles and responsibility are of the different enforcement officers is important, targeting education about the political individuals is important so that those elected officials know, but then you need to bring it all back together. Right? So if you look at each one of those as kind of the leg on a stool, you still need to pull it together and make a stool, and it has a top on it, and that's the community. So that was that idea of a systems approach, is that you needed to bring all of those individuals together in a room and talk about this as an important issue for the community, just like you're doing today as part of this Litter Summit, so that you're bringing all of that together. How many of you are government representatives, that you're associated with government? How many are nonprofits, right? So volunteer-based organizations. How many do we have any academics, educators in the room? Okay, we've got that. Business representatives in the room. All right, this is what we need to do for a systems approach, is to think about how you bring all of those people in the room and have a discussion about litter and illegal dumping, and the enforcement, again, is a piece of that. It's not going to solve the problem by itself, but that systems approach can show how they all work together in the process. And then education and training for haulers. Haulers to understand what's related to covered loads. That would include people who are doing demolition work or construction work, anyone that's involved in that process, but even the individuals that may have to be hauling stuff to and from a drop-off center, so that they understand what those provisions are and why you should cover your loads was another piece of that engagement. Tying to that, the waste management policies, trying to potentially bring together more understanding about policies and procedures, things that are causing unintentional littering as well as intentional litter, but especially the unintentional. I think that's where this was really targeted, is that again, a piece of this is having the infrastructure, the right infrastructure for waste management so that it doesn't lead to littering or illegal dumping, but how can we, make that as a recommendation, something that's very important to this process. And then I wanted to end with kind of the crossover a little bit between Pennsylvania and South Carolina, right? Basically not surprising. It's sort of like the issues in Pennsylvania are the issues in South Carolina. The issues in South Carolina are the issues in Pennsylvania. Everybody's concerned. They agree on there's an important part of this that enforcement is needing in both states. Overwhelmingly, both states agree that higher fines doesn't work. In South Carolina, they've gone one step further, though, because they've already addressed this. It's sort of like in 2018, they modified their statutes so that there's a more simplified structure for the fines. And as one of the interviewees from that study said, I went to the legislature as a representative of the South Carolina Litter Law Enforcement Association and told them we wanted lower fines, and they were like, I don't think we heard you correctly. And he says, no, we want a lower standard fine. And they were like, seriously? And he's like, yes. He said he literally had to argue with the legislators that it's like, this is going to be better. But as a result, as the president of that association, he says now he's seeing more tickets being written because the officer knows that it's sort of like they're comfortable with what that amount is too. So it validates, but then also makes that connection. Community service is an issue in both of the states. They do have a model, a couple of the states where, or a couple of the locations within South Carolina where they've got to flip the system and the individuals can do their community service in basically an unsupervised way. It's sort of like they're assigned a road segment, somewhat like Adopt a Highway. They're assigned a segment of road. They're going to get X number of hours if it's cleaned. The officers come back out and do an inspection of it. If it's clean and there are bags there and it really is the litter that came from that road segment, then they're going to get the credit for their community service hours. So again, some innovation things that have been discussed through the recommendations is a possibility. Both states have issues with the infrastructure and addressing that, and that lack, again, of a centralized database system in the process. So just in conclusion, the comment that was made about the happiness, it's sort of like, I think there is a lot of happiness that can come out of enforcement. That may seem like a strange thing for someone to say, but there is a dedication amongst the individuals who every day have many things that they have to deal with and helping to protect us from a variety of different factors. But those individuals that are dealing with litter and illegal dumping know that that's an important community issue. And that they're gonna continue the process of being out there and doing the enforcement. The statistics, the quantitative numbers show that it's sort of that's happening too. So it's sort of like there are people who are violating those laws and making this beautiful scenery less beautiful by depositing their waste there, are getting caught and being ticketed for that. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to look at how we can move forward in addressing and making that enforcement piece, again, that essential additional piece. Enforcement won't solve it by itself, but you have to have enforcement, and you need to be able to have all of the pieces that can make that process the most efficient, effective way of dealing with littering and illegal dumping happening too. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I think we have maybe a few minutes if anyone has questions, and then I would encourage you to join me this afternoon. That you'll have two presentations by two of the individuals that were involved in the study they're really going to be sharing their stories about this. That's the focus of the breakout. But if anyone has any questions, be glad to answer those now. Yes.
Hasn't gone anywhere yet. We're just figuring it out. Your recommendations find, there should be that simplification, like a traffic ticket, and also to match larger statewide efforts. So would your recommendations to the city governments and county governments be wait until the statewide has simplified their process and they match that, or just go on their own first?
It's like go on your own now. I always say it's actually better to lead than wait and follow, because you may never get anywhere. So the question asking about Pittsburgh kind of taking the lead and looking at their quality of life and having that ticketing, I would recommend that you begin that process, and that could be the groundswell that really maybe leads to the legislature saying, hey, this is being done in XYZ cities, and so we should look at that. Okay. Any others? That's good. Thank you.
So many, again, thank you to Cecile. Many of you participated in the study, and we also want to thank you for your time and contribution. We are anticipating releasing the final report in the next couple of weeks, next few weeks. So be on the lookout for that to hit your inbox. Just before we break for lunch, I once again want to thank our platinum sponsors, PA Beverage Association, Dow, and Republic Services, and our gold sponsors, Red House Communications, Lancaster Solid Waste Management Authority, and Encina for supporting this event. Lunch is a buffet that will be served for about an hour, and afterwards we'll have the Mayor of Lancaster, Darlene Sorace, here to speak to us, and so if you can come back promptly at 12:30, we'll see you then. Thank you.